Well, welcome back to Panorama Online. As we now move into session 5, let's do a little bit of review to get us caught up on where we're at. And I'm going to do this one visually using a map, my perfectly drawn map here. And so take a look at it with me. We find ourselves with the prologue. In the prologue, we have God creating the cosmos, inviting humans to be His representatives to essentially bless the world. He wants to bless the world through human representatives. That's creation. And we broke it up into Guam, God, universe, angels, and then mankind. And then what we saw is the fall has hijacked the plan of God. And now instead of bringing blessing to the nations and blessing to the cosmos, humans instead spread this disease called sin. And it's powerful and it's strong and it keeps enslaving them. And it's bringing creation down with it. So creation, fall, God will judge this particular group of humans at that time in what we now know as the flood. But even after the flood, this power of this disease called sin is still so strong, and people begin to declare themselves powerful to the level of God's. And that's going to be the Tower of Babel. When we get to after this story, we now have God calling a people to Himself, a family to Himself, to get back on track this plan of humans representing His blessing to the nations. And that family is the family of Abraham. Abraham is called from way over here. He grows up in Ur and he finds himself in a place called Haran. And God calls Abraham into the land and He says, I will give this land to you and your descendants forever. I will create a line of descendants through you, and through you I will bless the nations. And that family is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. If you remember, a lot of their story takes place in this particular area, which was called Canaan. Now we refer to it as Israel. And the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph ends with the people of Israel finding themselves right down here in the land of Egypt. And as we move into the redemption wanderings portion of the Panorama timeline, it begins like this. No longer are they in a place of blessing, they're now in a place of bondage. And we have Moses versus Pharaoh with 10 plagues. The Exodus event is them leaving the land of Egypt. They then go down to Mount Sinai, that's the Sinai event, and they also there build the tabernacle, which is basically a mini Eden. They go meet God on a mountain and build a tabernacle which represents Eden. The point is, God is dwelling with this people so that they might take the blessing, like Adam and Eve were supposed to do, out into the rest of the world. So you have Exodus event, Sinai event, tabernacle event. They then prepare for departure. They depart to go to the land, and they find themselves at rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. They listen to the majority report instead of the minority report. They then wander for 40 years, and after the end of that 40 years, they find themselves on the plains of Moab, and their leader Moses dies. As we move into the conquest movement, it begins with a new leader. His name is Joshua. They will meet this model of trust named Rahab. To get into the land, they first have to enter it, then they conquer it. And what that really looks like is through a central, southern, and northern campaign, they take out key military installations and military leaders, and people continually stay down here at Gilgal. We find them camped out right here at Gilgal, and Joshua gives his final challenge. He says, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And it ends with him saying, go out into the land called Israel and drive out the people that are there. If you don't, they will be thorns and thistles for you. They'll be snares and traps for you. They will turn your heart to their gods. That's how the book of Joshua ends. And as we've turned now to the book of Judges, or what we call the apostasy, I'm going to have us call it the downward spiral movement, is instead of going out into the land, they will find themselves terrified in the land and not trusting Yahweh. And that will lead to a downward spiral into sin. This power called sin, this disease called sin, is so strong and pervasive that it will corrupt the tribes of Israel. Now, here's how we remember our Panorama timeline, and we're on page 80, session 5. So if you look on page 80, here's where we're at so far. That's movements 1 through 4. And today we're going to be looking at apostasy. It covers the biblical books of Judges and Ruth. And the story that we just went over, if you want to see it on a timeline, here is the timeline. Abraham is roughly 2000 BC. The story of the Exodus is, some say, around 1500, 1446. Others put it around 1200 BC. That's the conquest with Joshua. We know that King David will be sometime around 1000 BC. So the period of Joshua is this period, or the period of Judges is this period after Joshua's conquest and before Saul, David, and Solomon. It's roughly a 200-year period that we are calling the apostasy, or the downward spiral. Let's do it this way: the downward spiral into sin. It's a 200-year period, and here's the way you're remembering it. 6 R's. I know the timeline here says incomplete conquest in Judges 2, then 6 and 6. Don't worry about that. 6 R's. Here's all you have to remember. 6 R's for the downward spiral movement, and they are these. The sin cycle, this little wheel represented right here, they begin in a place of rest, trusting Yahweh. But then they will rebel against Yahweh. They will do evil in the sight of Yahweh. God will bring retribution. I was talking about this doing this with a guy recently, and he remembers this by it being rest, rebellion, then God wrecks them with judgment. And I pointed out to him that the word wreck does not start with an R, and all of these are 5 R's, but he didn't know that. I guess he just forgot. So we have rest, rebellion, retribution, or wreck. Then the people cry out in repentance, Lord, save us. And then lastly, God will bring restoration. So those are the 5 R's of the sin cycle and in the book of Ruth. 6 R's. The sin cycle, 5 R's, and Ruth. That will help you remember this movement. 6 R's: rest, rebellion, retribution, repentance, restoration, and Ruth. And that is the Panorama Timeline, Session 5, Downward Spiral.